Welcome to our channel, where every day brings a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive into today's incredible tale, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our community reaches across the world. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. Trust me, you'll want to be here for tomorrow's story. It's one you definitely don't want to miss. Now get comfortable, and let's jump right into today's adventure. The judge threatened him with prison, but the soldier's calm response shocked everyone. Lieutenant Evan Prescott stood at attention beneath the blazing afternoon sun, his figure perfectly still against the grand backdrop of Buckingham Palace. It was the height of summer, and the temperature had soared well past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But Prescott remained composed, unflinching, a living statue of duty and tradition. His bright red tunic, pressed to flawless perfection, clung heavily to his body, yet not a wrinkle betrayed the oppressive heat. The black bearskin hat atop his head, steeped in history and ceremony, added even more weight, but Prescott bore it all without the slightest tremor. To the tourists gathered in the courtyard, snapping photos and whispering in awe, Evan Prescott was simply another member of the Queen's Guard, fulfilling a role that had become iconic across centuries. Few, if any, realized that behind the stoic posture and ceremonial uniform stood a man whose journey had been anything but ordinary. Prescott, at only 32 years old, had already led a life marked by exceptional discipline, bravery, and a deep commitment to both country and law. Before earning his place in the prestigious ranks of the Royal Guard, Prescott had served with distinction in the United States Army, completing multiple tours in Iraq. His actions under fire had earned him commendations for bravery and leadership, traits that had eventually caught the attention of the elite units responsible for protecting royal grounds. But what truly set him apart was not only his military prowess, it was his mind. Long before he picked up a rifle, Prescott had earned a law degree from Harvard University, graduating with top honors. He had studied constitutional law and military codes with a passion that few of his peers could match, blending academic excellence with battlefield experience in a way that made him uniquely formidable. Yet here he was, standing silently among the centuries-old stones of Buckingham Palace, presenting himself as just another ceremonial guard. It was part of the job, the discipline to suppress ego, the commitment to tradition, the understanding that the role was bigger than the man inside the uniform. Prescott accepted that without complaint. He respected the uniform, respected what it represented: steadfastness, sacrifice, honor. Around him, the palace courtyard buzzed with life. Families posed for photos, children waved excitedly, couples laughed as they tried to get the perfect selfie with the stoic guards in the background. Occasionally, someone would attempt to provoke a reaction, a funny face, a silly dance, a shouted joke. But Prescott never flinched. His gaze remained locked forward, fixed on a distant point only he could see. His breathing was slow, even. His hands gripped his ceremonial rifle with precise pressure, never too loose, never too tight. The sun continued its merciless assault, baking the pavement to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But Prescott made no move to wipe the sweat trickling down the side of his face. His training, his experiences in far harsher conditions, had steeled him against such discomforts. Every second he stood there was a testament to years of sacrifice, resilience, and unbreakable will. Most of the tourists would never know his story. They would leave with pictures and smiles, perhaps even jokes about the funny guards who never move. They wouldn't know about the young soldier who had led his unit out of an ambush in the deserts of Anbar province, or the brilliant student who had once argued constitutional interpretations in front of a mock Supreme Court. They would see only the surface, and that was fine with Prescott. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from knowing he upheld a legacy that demanded the very best from those who wore the uniform. And so, Evan Prescott stood, silent and strong, a symbol of tradition to the world, while inside him lived the fierce heart of a soldier, the sharp mind of a scholar, and the unshakable resolve of a man who knew exactly who he was and why he stood there. No matter how hot the sun blazed or how long the day stretched on. The afternoon sun hammered down even harder as the minutes dragged on, but Lieutenant Evan Prescott didn't so much as blink. His muscles ached under the strain of perfect posture, yet he stood firm, a living pillar of tradition. Around him, the buzz of tourists grew louder. Laughter, shouts, the occasional loud call for a photo. Prescott barely registered the noise. He was deep inside the mental fortress every true guard built, where discipline ruled and distractions were meaningless. That was when something shifted. It started with a soft gasp from somewhere to his left. A ripple went through the crowd, small at first, then growing as voices rose in alarm. Out of the corner of his eye, trained through years of combat experience to notice even the subtlest disturbances, Prescott caught sight of movement that didn't fit. A woman, elderly, frail, maybe in her mid-70s, was clutching at her chest. Her knees buckled. Her sun hat fell to the steaming stone pavement as she began to collapse. The rules flashed through Prescott's mind in an instant. Never move unless the palace itself is under threat. Guards had stood still through all kinds of emergencies, fainting tourists, unpredictable weather, even protests. The ceremony, the image of unbreakable resolve, had to be maintained. But there was something deeper than ceremony. Prescott had sworn another oath long before donning the ceremonial red, to protect life, to act when duty demanded, not just when rules allowed. And in that split second, instinct took over. With a sharp, controlled step forward, Prescott broke formation. Gasps echoed through the courtyard as cameras lowered and heads turned. In 3 quick strides, he was at the woman's side, catching her just before she hit the ground. Her skin was clammy to the touch. Her pulse, even through the thin material of his glove, was frighteningly weak. Gently, he lowered her to sit against the cooler shade of a nearby column, his movements precise and sure. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low but steady, the first time he had spoken in hours. The woman nodded faintly, struggling to breathe. Her lips were pale. Medicine," she whispered, gesturing weakly toward her handbag. Without hesitation, Prescott retrieved the small pill bottle, scanning the label. Nitroglycerin tablets. Heart medication. He placed a tablet under her tongue with practiced care, monitoring her breathing. It was shallow but steadying. He tilted her head slightly to keep her airway clear, remembering every lesson from battlefield medical training. "Someone call for medical help," Prescott barked over his shoulder, his voice carrying the authority that once commanded squads through gunfire. Instantly, several tourists fumbled with their phones, dialing emergency services. The courtyard, which had been noisy and casual moments ago, shifted into a tense, silent bubble. Children clung to their parents. Cameras pointed down instead of breeze, or for the first time that day, Prescott wasn't just a ceremonial figure in the background. He was the center of the story. He kept his focus locked on the woman, noting every shallow breath, every twitch of her fingers. He didn't look up when the clicking of expensive leather shoes approached, didn't flinch when the sharp voice cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" a man barked, his tone impatient and arrogant. Prescott knew better than to respond without assessing the situation fully. Still crouched beside the woman, he kept his voice level. "Medical emergency, she's stable for now. Paramedics are on the way." The man scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "And what about your post, soldier? Abandoning it to play doctor?" Prescott finally looked up, his sharp blue eyes meeting those of the newcomer. A tall, silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored navy suit, the kind that practically screamed old money and unchecked authority. On his wrist, a heavy gold watch caught the sun. On his lapel, a small badge identified him as something more, a Crown Court judge. The tension in the air thickened like a gathering storm. Prescott knew, even before the man opened his mouth, again, that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was going to be a confrontation. one he hadn't sought, but one he would meet with the same quiet strength he brought to every battlefield he had ever survived. He adjusted his grip gently on the woman's hand, squeezing once, reassuringly. Whatever storm was about to break, over his head, Prescott was ready. Judge Franklin Monroe stood over Lieutenant Evan Prescott with an expression that could freeze molten steel. His perfectly pressed navy suit, glinting cufflinks, and polished leather shoes screamed authority. His voice, sharp and cutting, carried across the courtyard as more tourists turned their attention toward the brewing confrontation. "I am Judge Franklin Monroe, Crown Court," he announced loudly, making sure everyone within earshot knew exactly who he was. "What I have just witnessed is a clear dereliction of duty." Prescott rose smoothly from where he knelt beside the elderly woman, who was now breathing more steadily thanks to his quick action. Paramedics rushed past Monroe, kneeling to take over the care of the woman, but Monroe didn't spare them a glance. His focus, almost predatory, stayed locked on Prescott. "You there," Monroe barked, stepping closer. "Your sole responsibility is to maintain your post, not to play nursemaid to civilians. You've disgraced the uniform you wear." Prescott's jaw tightened, but he kept his posture formal and his gaze forward. Rules dictated that on-duty guards remain silent unless directly ordered otherwise, even in the face of provocation. His silence only seemed to enrage Monroe further. "Nothing to say for yourself?" Monroe sneered, tapping the edge of his expensive watch impatiently. "Perhaps you think being a soldier excuses you from the law. It does not." The crowd around them had swelled again. Families, tourists, even a few older veterans in the crowd watched the unfolding scene with growing discomfort. Two retired Marines, both wearing faded service caps, exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing yet. Monroe took a slow, deliberate step closer, closing the gap until his breath, laced with expensive aftershave, was just inches from Prescott's face. "Under Section 12 of the Royal Protection Act," Monroe intoned with false authority, "leaving your post without command permission constitutes a direct violation of national security protocol, punishable by immediate suspension, forfeiture of wages, and formal court-martial." Prescott recognized the tactic instantly. Loud declarations, legal-sounding jargon, overwhelming the accused into submission. He had seen it done before, in courtroom videos during his Harvard training. Monroe was trying to bulldoze him with invented laws and fabricated penalties, betting that no one here would dare question a man with a badge and a booming voice. But Monroe had picked the wrong man. Still, Prescott said nothing. He knew patience was a weapon, and Monroe, mistaking silence for weakness, pressed on. Furthermore, Monroe continued, his voice rising theatrically, "Your actions have made a mockery of centuries of tradition. Every tourist here, every foreign visitor will go home believing Britain's royal guards are soft, undisciplined, and unworthy." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Disapproval, confusion. But Monroe ignored them, basking in his imagined dominance. "I have full authority to fine you on the spot," Monroe declared, pulling a small leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket with a flourish. £500 minimum, more if the court decides your behavior constitutes gross negligence. Scribbled something quickly, his pen never actually touching paper. A trick meant only for show. Prescott remained a stone, unmoving, unreactive. The two retired Marines had edged closer now, their faces grim. They, at least, recognized the signs. A man abusing authority, a public servant turning a proud tradition into a weapon for his own ego. "Of course," Monroe added with a condescending smirk, "if you were to apologize, admit your misconduct, and beg for leniency, perhaps I could be persuaded to recommend a lighter penalty." Still, Prescott said nothing. Sweat dripped down, his temples in the blistering heat, but he did not wipe it away. His discipline was absolute. His mind, however, was already working at lightning speed, recording every false statement Monroe spewed, every procedural violation he committed. Monroe, sensing he was losing the crowd, grew bolder and more reckless. "I have half a mind," Monroe barked, his voice loud enough to echo against the palace walls. To call your commanding officer and insist on your dishonorable discharge by nightfall. He pulled out his smartphone, dramatically punching at the screen. Yes, Minister, he said into the dead air, pretending to have someone important on the line. I'm at Buckingham Palace now. Serious breach of protocol. Recommend immediate action. The lie was so blatant that a ripple of disbelief swept through the crowd. A woman holding a travel guide gasped and shook her head. One of the retired Marines clenched his fists at his sides, but Monroe didn't notice. He was lost in his performance, riding the high of imagined power, building up to what he thought would be the final blow. And by tomorrow morning, Monroe declared, snapping his phone shut and glaring at Prescott. You'll be lucky if you're mopping floors in the back of some forgotten barracks. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between outrage and fear. Cameras were recording now. Eyewitnesses whispered. Tension thickened in the summer air. Still, Evan Prescott did not move, did not speak, did not even blink. But in his mind, the battle lines were drawn, and he knew the moment to strike back was coming. Soon. For a long, charged moment, Lieutenant Evan Prescott remained perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch between them. The crowd watched, breathless, feeling the weight of something shifting in the air. Monroe smirked, believing he had won. His smug grin widened as he stepped closer, holding out a crisp business card between two manicured fingers. My chambers, Monroe said, his voice dripping with superiority. You'll report there tomorrow by noon, or I'll issue a formal warrant for your arrest. Failure to comply will only make things worse. He waved the card mockingly, right in front of Prescott's face. And that was the moment Prescott moved, with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Prescott shifted his weight, lifted his head, and, for the first time, locked eyes with Judge Franklin. Monroe. The sudden intensity in Prescott's gaze was like a gunshot through the crowd. Calm, steady, deadly serious. Sir, Prescott said, his voice low and even, carrying the quiet force of authority earned through blood and discipline. I must respectfully ask you to remove your hand from my uniform. Monroe's smirk faltered. Confusion flickered across his face. His hand, frozen in the air between them, dropped slowly to his side. I beg your pardon, Monroe said, recovering quickly, trying to reassert control. You seem to be confused about who you're speaking to. No, sir, Prescott said firmly. I'm not confused at all. He took one small step forward. Enough to close the distance. Enough to make Monroe instinctively retreat half a step without realizing it. The crowd leaned in, sensing something big was about to happen. There are no sections 12, 23, or 47 in the Royal Protection Act, Prescott continued, his voice razor-sharp. No Parliamentary Protection of Ceremonial Guards Act exists, and as a Crown Court judge, you have no authority to issue fines, recommend dishonorable discharges, or make summary rulings on military personnel. Monroe's mouth opened, but no words came out. You, Prescott said, his voice growing harder, have fabricated legal citations, misrepresented your authority, and attempted to intimidate a serving member of the armed forces in front of dozens of witnesses. The silence was electric. Cameras captured every word. The two retired Marines now stood shoulder to shoulder behind Prescott, their arms crossed over their chests, silent pillars of support. Monroe sputtered, color draining from his face. You don't understand the gravity of what you're saying. I understand perfectly, Prescott said, cutting him off. And I also understand that your physical contact with my uniform constitutes battery under the Military Personnel Protection Act. A real statute, by the way. Punishable by up to 2 years imprisonment. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One tourist whispered to another, Is this really happening? Phones were held higher, recording everything. You threatened me with fabricated consequences, invented conversations with government officials, and made a mockery of your office, Prescott continued. And now you're standing here exposed. Monroe looked around, desperately seeking a friendly face, some way to claw back the authority slipping. From his grasp, he found none. Every face, young, old, foreign, local, stared back at him with a mixture of shock, disapproval, and something worse. Disappointment. I was simply ensuring proper protocol, Monroe stammered, his voice smaller now, less commanding. You were abusing your position, Prescott corrected calmly, and you are now accountable for it. At that moment, one of the retired Marines stepped forward, his voice booming across the courtyard. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, retired. 30 years of service, including military judiciary oversight. I witnessed the entire event. And I'll be submitting a full statement. The second veteran followed immediately. Major Richard Hargrove, 28 years service, also recording everything on my phone. Monroe's face turned ashen. Prescott returned to standing at attention, rifle at his side, his gaze once again fixed forward. But the damage was done. Monroe, for all his bluster and arrogance, stood exposed, powerless, humiliated, and caught red-handed in front of a growing audience. The courtyard buzzed now, not with idle tourist chatter, but with the crackling energy of a reckoning. Lieutenant Evan Prescott hadn't just defended himself. He had defended the honor of every man and woman who had ever stood silently, proudly, in the uniform of service. And the storm was only just beginning. Judge Franklin Monroe stood frozen, looking smaller by the second as the weight of his lies bore down on him. Around him, the crowd grew dense, silent, and unrelenting. The tourists who had once admired his flashy suit now watched him with thinly veiled contempt. The two retired officers, Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore and Major Hargrove, stood like sentinels, their presence a physical reminder that real authority wasn't something you could fake. Not here, not today. I believe, Whitmore said, voice booming across the courtyard, that Judge Monroe's conduct constitutes misconduct in public office, abuse of authority, and attempted intimidation of military personnel. The word struck Monroe harder than any physical blow. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but thought better of it when he saw the unwavering eyes staring back at him. Prescott's steady gaze, the Marine's disapproving stares, the cameras capturing every moment. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Monroe said weakly, his voice cracking under the strain. He adjusted his tie again, a nervous tick now rather than a display of power. You're right about one thing, Prescott replied coolly, not moving an inch from his perfect military stance. There's been a misunderstanding. You misunderstood who you were dealing with. The crowd murmured, a sound that was more a rumble than a whisper. Monroe's shoulders slumped further. I was merely trying to uphold ceremonial standards. Monroe attempted again, his tone desperate, pleading. And you did so, Whitmore shot back, by inventing laws, falsely citing government officials, and physically accosting a soldier in uniform? Major Hargrove held up his phone. It's all recorded, every word, including your fake phone call to the Minister of Defense. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, a young tourist who had been filming from the start. I have it too, she said loudly. Full video, including when he poked the guard. Monroe looked around, trapped, realizing there was no escape. Every lie, every fabricated threat, every moment of arrogance was caught on tape and burned into the memory of everyone present. Finally, he sagged. I realize now that I may have overstepped, Monroe said, voice barely above a whisper. I apologize unreservedly to Lieutenant Prescott. The words hung in the thick summer air. No one applauded. No one cheered. It wasn't enough. Prescott stood silent, unmoving, his discipline absolute, but his very presence spoke louder than any lecture could. I would advise, Whitmore said sharply, that Judge Monroe also prepare for a formal inquiry by the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. There are serious violations that will not be overlooked. Monroe nodded shakily, his pride shattered, his reputation already bleeding out into the courtyard's hot stones. The path out of the crowd parted for him like a scar, tourists stepping aside without a word, without a glance. His walk of shame was slow, stiff, and miserable, each step dragging him further from the power he once thought invincible. As Monroe disappeared beyond the palace gates, the atmosphere began to shift. Quiet conversations resumed. Tourists resumed their photos, but now with a different kind of reverence. Eyes that once glanced past the guards as curiosities now lingered with genuine respect. Prescott remained at his post, his uniform immaculate despite the heat, his rifle resting perfectly against his shoulder. He showed no sign that anything extraordinary had happened, but those who had witnessed it would remember. They would remember the guard who stood firm not just in ceremony but in truth, who honored both tradition and justice without ever raising his voice. As the sun dipped, lower in the London sky, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Lieutenant Evan Prescott remained where he had been from the beginning, silent, steady, and stronger than stone. Behind the bright red tunic and bearskin hat was not just a soldier, he was a man of unwavering honor, and no storm, no bully in a tailored suit could ever take that away. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, we would love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about Lieutenant Prescott's courage, his calm, under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to truth and duty? Do you believe that standing up for what's right, even against powerful figures, is worth the risk? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone quietly, but powerfully, defended their honor without ever raising their voice? Share your thoughts, your reflections, or even your personal experiences down in the comments below. We truly value hearing from you. Your voice helps keep the spirit of stories like this alive. And if you're watching from somewhere around the world, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's incredible to see how these stories connect people from every corner of the globe. Don't forget to like the video if you believe in standing firm for justice, and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss tomorrow's story, another powerful reminder of how courage can change everything. We can't wait to read what you have to say.